Well, it's Filling in the History. This is episode 7. Welcome back. It's good to see you. I can't see you. I'm just making that up. But yeah, this is another episode. We're going to be talking today about Doctrine and Covenants, section 10 and section 11. And since that's just two parts that we're going to have, the third part is actually going to be about two of Joseph Smith's brothers. We're going to be talking about Hyrum Smith, and we're going to be talking about Samuel Smith, which I learned a lot about in the research of this, which I feel kind of bad about because he's actually an enormously significant figure as well. Hyrum Smith is far better known mostly because he and Joseph Smith, what's the grammar there, were murdered together in Carthage jail. So Hyrum was killed first. Joseph was killed very shortly after that, and so they were best friend brothers for the majority of their lives. Hyrum was older, and Samuel was younger than Joseph, actually. So we're going to talk about all of them because there's some very interesting stories that come about in this process. So talking about section 10 is going to be mostly about do you, you've lost 116 pages of the book of Lehi. What do you do? That's a lot. That's a lot of work. So what do you do with that? Do you retranslate it or do you just let it go? So there's a revelation about that. Section 11 is actually directed to Hyrum Smith, very much in the same vein as Joseph Sr., which is Joseph Smith's father. Joseph Smith's father receives section 4 for himself, and section 11 is also heavily used, I would say, in Latter-day Saint culture a lot, especially when it comes to callings, when it comes to revelations, and when it comes to preparing for missions and serving full-time missions for the church. Hyrum Smith did serve a few missions. We'll get into that. But those are the sections and the parts that we're going to talk about today. So welcome back. And if you don't know, like, subscribe, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. Hope you're enjoying it. It's been kind of fun to interact with some of you as well. And I really appreciate what you're doing because I'm trying to keep this really informative and something that hopefully is interesting for you to listen to. So, here we go again. So part 1 is section 10. A little bit of, and I'm also trying to structure things a little better. So now we're going to do a papers introduction, a circumstantial introduction, and then maybe a little bit of the aftermath of what happened after these sections were received. So for section 10, all we get out of section 10 is the back portion of it. So I would say probably the first 2 pages, maybe page of in terms of Revelation book pages, by the way, is actually missing. So the fullest or the most complete extant version of section 10 that we have comes from, again, the little teeny tiny book, the 1833 Book of Commandments. In this case, section 10 is actually chapter 9. And then it's also in the 1835 first version of the Doctrine and Covenants. So that's the very most complete version of it. But the good news is that we have sort of the latter half of it inside of the Revelation book. So there's something there. And because of that, we don't know if in the book it was called a commandment or a law or something like that. Our best guess is that it was in the book. And again, we'll get to that in a second. But most of the introductory phrases of like the Book of Commandments or the Doctrine and Covenants usually came from, if you will, suggested from the writing of John Whitmer inside of the Revelation Book 1. So we're going to make the same assumption here for sections 10 and 11. So one thing we do have that I haven't mentioned before that I should have is that the Revelation book has an index. Now, if you want to complain about putting indexes together, try doing it by hand. So that's the index is in the back part of Revelation Book 1. And in the back of Revelation Book 1, you will see it is actually called a second commandment to Joseph the seer. So my guess is that commandments would have been in very large letters up at the top like we've seen in other places. And apparently, according to the index, it would have been on pages 8 through 12. We still have pages 11 and 12. So again, I'm assuming that it's at least a full page, and who knows how much of that other page was missing. So that's the introduction to what we're reading today, what we're actually looking at today. where it begins, by the way, just in case you want to follow along in your own scriptures, if you want to see it, it says, quote, shall publish it as a record of Nephi, and thus I will confound those which have altered my words, etc., etc. So that is what we would now call Doctrine and Covenants, section 10, verse 42, partway verse through 42. So a lot of the stuff before this, which would have been interesting to see if there was any corrections or something, we don't have that. It's been lost. As part of a large gathering, if you haven't heard before, they took a gathering out. They took a gathering out of the Revelation book. I'm assuming to print it, or who knows what. I mean, maybe it was destroyed for nefarious and evil reasons. Who knows? But anyway, yeah, it's just gone. It never got brought back, so we don't have it, which is okay. So again, yeah, full version. The original is 1833. So it's chapter 9 in the Book of Commandments. And it is section 36 in the original Doctrine and Covenants. Again, kind of put back there. The section headings, and this is going to happen, unfortunately, a lot in this era. There wasn't a lot of extra, like there was a commandment later in church history where they were commanded in a revelation that's in a section of the Doctrine and Covenants to keep a record and to be very much better about please keeping your records better than you have. And a lot of what I've talked about previous to this and what's made some of these episodes a little shorter than others is that we just don't have a lot of record keeping. In this case, we actually get straight up confused. So the section headings show this as happening in May of 1829. That's in both of the Doctrine and Covenants and the Book of Commandments. However, if you're reading in the current version, and just so you know, there are tiny versions of the current version too. So lest we think that only, the 1800s gets to enjoy pocket-sized books. Not so. But that's my 2013 edition that I have. That's not on my phone like everybody else's. But anyway, the 2013 version states, it was likely around April of 1829, though portions may have been received as early as the summer of 1828. So we're going to get into how this was maybe structured in the historical introduction, and that's where we're going to next. So what are the circumstances surrounding it? So again, all we have the Book of Commandments version. We have some of the Revelation Book 1 version of it. So what brought this about? Well, the historical introduction from Documents Volume 1 of the Joseph Smith Papers says this. Joseph Smith and Cowdery apparently picked up the translation where Joseph Smith and Herod had left off in the book of Mosiah. As Joseph Smith and Cowdery approached what would become the end of the Book of Mormon, they grew concerned about whether to go back and retranslate the lost portion. So I think this might have answered my question. I've said before, why is this way later? And even though it was kind of given earlier in draft 2 and in the manuscript histories of the church, I think it was this. I think it was they were trying to be a little bit more chronological about it, is what I'm gathering from this. Another thing we get here is the revelation featured below stated that wicked men had changed the lost manuscript to discredit Joseph Smith and commanded him not to retranslate the lost pages, but to substitute another record in their place. This substitute record, described as being, quote, engraven upon the place of Nephi, covered the same period as the lost manuscript. So in Nephite history, or as I like to call it, in Lehite history, Nephite Lamanite history, apparently what they translated covers the same time period, so you're covered. And there's a lot of messaging about how intentional this was. So the preceding quote, what came from the historical introduction to Documents Volume 1 here, is it actually notes the preface to the Book of Mormon. So in the original 1830 edition of the Book of Mormon, the preface very clearly talks about there was 116 pages. It was called the Book of Lehi, and those pages were lost. And we have very actively chosen not to retranslate those because people are being naughty out there, and they're probably going to discredit us, right? All the things. And so in the preface, they are quoting the Lord here in a revelation that says, therefore thou shalt translate from the plates of Nephi until you come to that which ye have translated, which ye have retained. So just fill in that blank and keep going with what you already have, is what they're saying here. There are some issues with the dating of this revelation, actually. So let's get into why is our current version, the 2013 edition of the Doctrine and Covenants, different from what they originally printed? Well, it says here, John Whitmer's dating was lost, again, because that first part of Doctrine and Covenants, section 10, is gone from the Revelation books. The index locates it between two April 1829 texts. So that's your first clue, and that's probably why the editors of the current edition of Doctrine and Covenant Scriptures say that it was in 1829. The Book of Commandments and Doctrine and Covenants puts this in May of 1829, so there's a month difference there. But if you know, like, since the Book of Mormon translation is rocking hot, days matter. They actually knock this project out once they get to concentrate on it pretty quickly. Before that, they're running around and hiding plates and just trying to keep it safe. But when they find a little piece, they actually get moving pretty quickly on it. So draft 2 says this. This is from the Manuscript History of the Church. It says, after I had obtained the above revelation, both the plates and the Urim and Thummim were taken from me again, but in a few days they were returned to me. And that's kind of where things get confused. And I believe, and that's why it was so close to what we now call section 3. So the Joseph Smith manuscript history, that was 1838. So again, this is at least 9 years later. He's kind of saying like, oh yeah, I got the Urim and Thummim, and then immediately I got this, which kind of indicates that Martin Harris was still in the picture. Oliver Cowdery wasn't quite there yet, all that kind of stuff. And so there's a bit of a confusion there. So in Histories Volume 1 from the Joseph Smith Papers, there's a footnote that I think bears mentioning here, which says Mulholland's insertion of the revelation at this point and his contextualization of its receipt, an explanation apparently composed under the direction of Joseph Smith, contradict the May 1829 dating of the revelation, given in both the 1833 Book of Commandments and the 1830 Doctrine and Covenants, and repeated here. Since the first 2 pages of the Revelation are missing from the earliest extant copy of the Revelation in Revelation book, it is impossible to know what specific date may have been listed in that source. But it was situated among revelations dated April 1829, and the index of Revelation Book 1 gives the year as 1829. Although the brief explanation that Mulholland penned in the history suggests that the revelation originated in summer of 1828, which is a year earlier, content analysis suggests that at least some of the material originated about April 1829. And this is what I love about the people who did the Joseph Smith Papers. There's forensic evidence. They do handwriting analysis, writing style analysis. I mean, they'll even talk about how smooth the pen goes and how much they have to dip ink. I mean, they go really forensic about it. It's really cool. Anyway, so that's why the carbon dating of this, if you will, was altered. And so that is something that changed between the 1981 version of the Doctrine and Covenants, which most living members of the church have in their possession now. And this used to actually quote from the history of the church. Those references were more or less taken away from the introductions of the sections. And then when you get these changes like this to dates, this is why, is because they actually had a team of people really researching where this could have come from. And so that's why in the current versions of it, which you know, if you're a member, you're probably looking at this on your phone, you're going to see some date changes, or hopefully to tighten it up and say, oh, it actually was on this specific day or that specific day rather than summer of 1828, right? We can get a better sense of it. So again, big shout out to the enormous amount of work that I can't even possibly comprehend that would have gone into that. And then they have a solution here, which I love, which is also from the historical introduction. A potential solution to these complexities is to consider the featured text a composite of 2 revelations, one from 1828 and the other 1829. The stylistic features of this revelation, however, strongly suggest that although Joseph Smith may have received the first portion of the revelation in the summer of 1828, it was not actually written down until April or May 1829, along with the rest of the text. This revelation, written in the first-person voice of Jesus Christ, more closely resembled Joseph Smith's April 1829 texts, which include such proclamations as, "Behold, I am God," than it does in July 1828 revelation. which speaks of God in the second person. The text featured below also lacks the typical signs of a composite revelation, such as an amen marking the end of a particular revelation within a larger text. So for reference here, if you look at something like 107, section 107 is really big on this. There are several places where if you really wanted to, you could cut it off. There's an amen, there's an entire theme and subject going on there, and then it moves on to another subject. That is because 107, for example, just to give you one example, is an amalgamation of different revelations that were given over a period of time. So this is something that happened, and the saints back then were very keen on these being living texts. We'll get to one that I really love today that Joseph put his own hand to on the Book of Mormon, specifically in the Words of Mormon, which is a kind of a subset. It's a book, if you will, but it's called Words of Mormon. Anyway, but they would change these things, and they would bolt things together if they needed to. I guess it just depended on what they felt was right. So we get this revelation, and again, the main theme of it here is, and it's very explicitly clear, do not retranslate that. Let it go. And there are a couple of instances where, like in the Book of Mormon itself, in the text of the Book of Mormon itself, Words of Mormon, I believe in 1st Nephi, there are these prophet historians, if you will, like writing down like, I'm making another set. I don't really know why I'm doing this, but I feel strongly that I need to do it, so I'm going to do it. And those writings are what we currently have today. So, and then, of course, even in this section, the Lord, if you will, is speaking through this revelation saying like, he's like, yeah, I kind of knew this was going to happen. Again, I think that's remarkable. 116 pages is a lot of text. So what are the results of this? They don't retranslate this. 116 pages to this day remain lost. We've never seen them again. What happens? So what do we get instead of the Book of Lehi? Well, the Book of Mormon preface from the original Book of Mormon publication in 1830 says, therefore thou shalt translate from the plates of Nephi until ye come to that which ye have translated, which ye have retained. So section 10 gives, in my opinion, a little clarification of what that means. So therefore, you shall translate the engravings which are on the plates of Nephi down even till you come to the reign of King Benjamin, or until you come to that which you have translated, which you have retained. And behold, you shall publish it as the record of Nephi, and thus I will confound those who have altered my words. So for those of you who may not know the stories of the Book of Mormon, there are several divisions, okay? The first one is called the Small Plates of Nephi. And a lot of people liken this even to kind of like a book of Moses, like the books of Moses sort of thing, where it's they're a lot smaller in their size, but this is kind of the early era of the Nephite, Lamanite, or as I like to call it, the Lehite civilization in ancient America. Sort of the beginning days of that. And then you get this thing called Words of Mormon, and it's literally like a break saying, hey, I hope you've enjoyed reading the Small Plates of Nephi. You're about to get in what's called the Large Plates of Nephi, and this is going to be a lot more historical. And this is where Mormon is the voice from here on out, why it is called the Book of Mormon, and that's why. Mormon abridges these, puts a lot of these stories into his own words, and it starts, and he says, hey, just so you know, there's been wars and there's been stuff and things, but I just decided not to even abridge these plates. I'm just going to put them on top here, and that gets translated. I'll get into that in a second. And then you get Words of Mormon explaining what he just did. And then we kind of go back into the narrative, and it starts with this king called King Benjamin. And that is the first part of what we now call the Book of Mosiah. So from that moment all the way until, I would say about 3/4 of the way through the Book of Mormon, that is all a Mormon abridgment. He is occasionally quoting people, but mostly it's him, his voice telling the story all the way to that end. He is killed before his book is finished. His son Moroni picks up the rest of that sort of story that he has, finds some more plates that they found, which is from an entirely different civilization called the Jaredites. He abridges that down into a book called the Book of Ether. He has some room left, so he writes some more. That's called the Book of Moroni, and that's called the Book of Mormon. There's an entire stack of these things inside of the gold plates that is sealed. No one's ever touched it. And then you have the Book of Lehi, which is lost. So there you go. That is the, I hope I didn't miss anything there. So what did we get instead of the Book of Lehi? As far as we can tell, and from a lot of the contextual stuff that we've had, we get what is called the small plates of Nephi. Again, what does that mean? First and second books of Nephi. Jacob, Enos, Jerem, Omni. A little wink there for the song. But yeah, we get the 2 books of Nephi, Jacob and Enos, and Jerem and Omni. Now, if you don't know, again, Enos, Jerem, and Omni are like a whopping 1 chapter long. They're all very short books. And you kind of get the sense that they're like running out of room and we got to stop, you know, and they say that. They're like, there's not a whole lot of room on these plates. So I'm not going to say a whole lot here. And then we get the Words of Mormon. Again, that is from a translation. And it comes as an introduction for everything that came before it. And then sort of a chronological insertion of a story, although it's written, I want to say, 600 years later, if my math is correct there, or thereabouts, about maybe 500 years, 400 years later, a long time later, is basically Mormons saying, hey, I'm just to explain what's going on, what the structure of this book is. All of that, by the way, is lost from the original manuscript of the Book of Mormon. In our previous episode, I think I might have mentioned, the original was severely water damaged. It was in a cornerstone of the Nauvoo temple. Most of it turned to mush. And we have lost the entire book of Mosiah. So that's gone. However, we still have the printer's manuscript of the Book of Mormon, and that's the good news. What I love about this is, and here is a facsimile photograph of the printer's manuscript version of the Words of Mormon. And something I love about this, for those grammar files out there and people who used to really correct the who's and the whom's, Joseph Smith's own hand, ladies and gentlemen, corrects words to who, and we get a whom in there from the hand of Joseph Smith himself. So, boy, if you're a believer, the whom is should have divine significance now. I joke, but anyway, so that's what we currently have. So our versions of the Words of Mormon, the entire Book of Mosiah, and I would even say Ether's lost. Like a lot of those things are gone. Those are retained still in the printer's manuscript of the Book of Mormon, which is cool. And like I said a little while ago, the church retained ownership of the printer's manuscript of the Book of Mormon. We also have access to original photostatic copies that were made way back in 1928, which gives a little bit of extra clarity into the lettering because these things fade over time. And those are now held in the archives of the church, in the church history library. So, yeah. So, yeah, we start with Mosiah, the beginning of the reign of King Benjamin. The rest of the Book of Mormon is more or less just kept the way it is, and the sealed portion is never touched. So, like I said, the 116 pages lost to this day as per instruction. And yeah. And so in our next section, we're going to be talking about, our next part, we're going to be talking about section 11, which is directed towards a very influential person in Joseph's life. We've already talked about Alvin. We've already talked about Joseph Smith Sr. We've spoken a lot about Emma. We've spoken a lot about his mother, Lucy Mack Smith. In this case, we're going to be talking about Hyrum Smith. But also, there's a wonderful story in here about Samuel Smith, who's, again, another wonderful influence. So part 2 coming up, section 11. Enjoy. Okay, part 2. This is section 11, what we now call section 11 of the Doctrine and Covenants. And a little bit of an introduction to the papers itself surrounding this revelation. So the index, because we don't have it anymore in the Revelation books, the index shows this as, quote, the first commandment to Hyrum, or Hyrum Smith. So my guess, again, is John Whitmer would have put big old letters commandment above this particular revelation. According to the index of the Book of Commandments, it would have been on page 15. So the earliest extant version is the 1833 Book of Commandments. It shows up as chapter 10. And in this little teeny tiny book that we still have, it is very clear. It just says, given to Hyrum in Harmony, Pennsylvania, dated of May 1829. The first Doctrine and Covenants version in 1835 shows this as section 37. So again, shoved a little back there. And a lot of the early sections that we have, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, a lot of these are in the 30s. They're way in the back, although section 3 is kind of off on its own, or section 6, I'm sorry, is off on its own. A lot of these more or less happen in that order. And so more or less, as I like to say, we've retained the general order of it, even though in modern versions of scriptures, especially in like the 1981 version of the Doctrine and Covenants or the 2013 version, they're kind of towards the beginning to show and give the reader a chronological reading of as these things came along. So the ordering of the revelations, this is what's funny. So the manuscript history of the church, what we would now call the history of the church, most of it comes from Draft 2, James Mulholland's handwriting, dictated for a very long time the history and the ordering of these revelations. And so because of that, I thought you might enjoy how wacky this numbering actually got as opposed to what we have today. So if you were to read the history of the church, and I'm going to give another shout out to my floppy paperback version that I have here that I've just been eating up lately preparing for these episodes. I started looking through and just writing down how these sections come about. So if you're going to read them that way, the sections come as follows. Section 2 comes first because that's just an extract from the history. That's the Malachi prophecy from Moroni. Then you get section 3. Then you get section 10. And then 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Did pretty good there. And then it's 13. But again, section 13 as we have it is, again, just an extracted story. This is the, upon you, my fellow servants, section 13, that gets extracted and put in, into our Doctrine and Covenants today. And then it's 11, 12, 14, 15, 16, 17. So for the most part in order. And then you get the testimony of the 3 witnesses. And I put that down because that was a commanded thing from the Lord in a revelation about having 3 witnesses that is published in every single book of the Book of Mormon from 1830 to now. It's always been there. It just used to be in the very back of the book instead of the front of the book. After that, you get the testimony of the 8 witnesses to the Book of Mormon. So for those of you who may not know, it's not that Joseph Smith kept this to himself. There are official, we are putting our names down. We saw this. This is a legal document. 11 people. If you count Joseph, that's 12. That have actually hefted, seen, handled, like I said, smelled, tasted, touched. I hope they didn't taste it. I think that would not have been allowed, is my guess. And then there's a bunch of other stories about people who got to see them. Lucy Mack got to see the outline. Emma, maybe even Reuben Hale. There's all sorts of people that were involved in this that saw them. So lots of people. Anyway, so that's the ordering that you get. And then after that, you get into sections about church organization. So that's section 20 and 21 and so forth and so on. That's how these things are ordered in the original history of the church, which, again, if you don't know, was how up until the 1981 edition of the scriptures, which means it was that way until 2012, is how we got our information about the Doctrine and Covenants. So this was the ordering, even though they may not have followed it in how they published the Doctrine and Covenants. So that's what we've got. And there's not a lot there because, like I said, it's lost from the Revelation books. So kind of brief there. Circumstantially, leading up to section 11, and hold on to your seats here, nerds out there, history nerds, but draft 1, holy cow, starts to show up finally. I've been talking about draft 2 a ton. Draft 1 actually appears. It finally arrives, and what we get is a really beautiful story. What I love about this, just to kind of bury the lead here, we get draft 1 is about, hey, Samuel Smith shows up, Hyrum Smith shows up and gets a revelation, and then it doesn't have anything else. So that's kind of where it ends. And then again, draft 2, we pick it up again from there. So, but for that shining moment, and I'm going to quote that today because boy, have we earned it. Draft 1 shows up. Anyway, so in earlier sections, if you don't know, there is a lot of indications that this came, and just the way the narration happens, that basically, we're going to get to this later on. So it's kind of weird that it's ordered this way. But the Aaronic priesthood restoration has already happened. So what that means in English is that an angel named John the Baptist, yes, that John the Baptist, is reported to have shown up to Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery after a question about baptism. He comes down instructs them. We have that, what he said, with that kind of the main theme of what he said. And that is now canonized in what we call section 13 of the Doctrine and Covenants. We'll get to that probably in our next episode. And he says, and he ordains them to a priesthood order called the Aaronic priesthood, named after Moses' brother Aaron. And he says, now you can baptize. You are to baptize by immersion. And also, when we're done here, what you have to do is, Joseph, you're going to actually ordain Oliver first to the Aaronic priesthood. Then Oliver, you're going to ordain Joseph to the Aaronic priesthood. Then you're going to walk into the water. And Joseph, you're going to baptize Oliver first. And then Oliver is going to baptize you. So all of this is done. And I'm going to kind of leave it there because I think Samuel's reaction to this story is very poignant. Anyway, so that's kind of where we are chronologically. This big thing has happened, and now, well, I'll just read it from. It'll be better coming from draft one. So draft one, yay, we made it. It took us long enough. Anyway, so draft writing, which again is the writing of James Mulholland, says we had been threatened with being mobbed from time to time. And this too by professors of religion, and their intentions of mobbing us, we were only counteracted by the influence of my wife's father's family, quotation, under divine providence, who had become very friendly to me and were opposed to mobs and were willing that I should be allowed to continue the work of translating or translation without interruption, and therefore offered and promised us protection from all unlawful proceedings as far as in them lay. After a few days, however, feeling it to be our duty, we commenced to reason out of the scriptures with our acquaintances and friends, and we happened to meet with them. About this time, my brother Samuel H. Smith came to visit us. We soon informed him of what the Lord was about to do for the children of men, and to reason with him out of the Bible. So again, apologies, I'm going to back the trolley up just a touch here and say, that's a great family story. You have Isaac Hale, and I think very reasonably, this stranger comes to town, marries his daughter. They more or less elope. Their parents aren't on board. They leave because it was just such a problem. But what an amazing thing. Even though Emma's patriarchal blessing later on kind of says, look, we know there's been a lot of affliction because of your father's family. Even with all of that and some bad blood, and Isaac Hale spoke out against Joseph, and he spoke out against this place. This church, the Book of Mormon, he really was he was very honest about it. He was not on board. And he was kind of an opponent, and a lot of people really didn't like him for it. But you got to give him credit for this. You're still my family. I don't agree with what you're doing, but there is no right that a mob has to come here and inflict violence on you. That ought to be, I mean, I am saying it loudly, that ought to be remembered in the history, that these people, in my opinion, the Hale family and the Smith family, were great people. They were not all believers, but they were still really good people. And so just, if I'm pushing that too hard, I just find that to be a very wonderful and inspirational story about, maybe you want to call it forgiveness or acceptance, diversity of thought. There's a lot of things here that are asking a lot of people. And so kudos to them, his wife's father's family, Emma Hale's family. I would say especially Isaac Hale, because I know he had a lot to say negatively about Joseph. So pretty remarkable there. And I'm really passionate about that one. So anyway, as you saw towards the end, Samuel shows up and they start talking to him about it. And I guess they start saying look, we're not just making this up. This is also in the Bible, right? And draft 2, by the way, I don't want to ignore that, is very close to draft 1 in the wording. But I got so excited we finally get to use another draft that I'm using draft 1. And I should also say that this is where the end of, if you're reading in the Pearl of Great Price, again, here's my little teeny copy of it. The Pearl of Great Price, at the very end of that, right before you get to the Articles of Faith, you have this thing called the Joseph Smith history, which is coming out of draft 2, coming out of the manuscript history of the church, but it ends here. Okay? It actually ends before Samuel shows up. And in my opinion, that makes sense because we're just getting into a section of the Doctrine and Covenants, and that's already been printed and all that stuff. But if you want to know where the Pearl of Great Price lets us go, It stops at, quote, "and therefore offered and promised us protection from all unlawful proceedings as far as in them lay." So thank you, Pearl of Great Price. We are now moving on from that. So yeah, that's where the Joseph Smith history, the canonized part of this history, is kind of comes to an end. So let's talk about Samuel Smith. This is an enormously important figure in the history of the church, and somebody that I'm going to be talking about, especially later on. But they start reasoning with him out of the Bible. Seems pretty positive. Here's where it gets fun. He seems to have a really hard time with what Oliver and Joseph are telling him. And again, if you know anything about the Smith family, they were very, very supportive of gold plates and angels and all this stuff that would seem really wacky. Even then, you have a brother who's a great guy and a lot of love for each other. He didn't just accept this stuff. So here's the story. Again, this is from Draft 2, because Draft 1 and Draft 2 sort of are the same thing here. It says, "We also showed him that part of the work which we had translated and labored to persuade him concerning the gospel of Jesus Christ, which was now about to be revealed in its fullness. He was not, however, very easily persuaded of these things. But after much inquiry and explanation, he retired to the woods in order that by secret and fervent prayer he might obtain of a merciful God wisdom to enable him to judge for himself. The result was that he obtained revelation for himself sufficient to convince him of the truth of our assertions to him. And on the blank," they left a little blank there, "day of that same month in which we had been baptized and ordained, Oliver Cowdery baptized him. And he returned to his father's house greatly glorying and praising God, being filled with the Holy Ghost." So if you don't know, technically speaking, not technically, the first baptized convert of the church is Samuel Smith, which is Joseph's younger brother. So Joseph Smith, as you may recall, was born in 1805. Samuel is born in 1808, so about 3 years younger than Joseph Smith, and is the first baptized convert. Goes into the woods, says his prayer, and comes back and says, "I believe," and he's baptized. And so the usage of this priesthood that John the Baptist comes down and apparently gives to these men is now being used to baptize others. And I think this bears some great importances. So after this, Samuel Smith is one of the 8 witnesses to the Book of Mormon, and his testimony and name has been printed in every book since 1830 to now. So Samuel Smith is one of those 8 witnesses. I think, considering this story at least, is, kind of, that makes sense. He is one of the original members of the church when it's organized in April 6th of 1830. Very few are actually members. There was a lot of people there. A lot more people than the 6 that I think they required a minimum of that in order to be a legitimate religion, but there's a lot of people there. So the original 6, they did their thing, and then almost immediately after that, a lot of these people actually were baptized that were in Fayette, New York, where the church was organized. And then he actually is not just the first convert, not just an 8 witness, not just the original sort of cohort of members that actually formed the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saint. He is the first proselyting missionary of the church. And a lot of people who serve full-time missions maybe already know this, but yeah, he was the first missionary of the church. He gives a Book of Mormon to the man by the name of John Green in a tavern, by the way. That leads to John giving it to his brother-in-law, who has a bit of an attitude about stuff, had a really hard time with it, fought with it for a couple of years, actually, before he decided to join the church. And he's a little guy that you might have heard of called Brigham Young. And so that first mission brought about some pretty heavy hitters. But Samuel Smith is the first proselyting missionary of the Church of Jesus Christ. It was not called the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in 1830. That name came through another revelation that's in the Doctrine and Covenants, but he is the very first missionary of the church. First convert, he's a witness, he's the first cohort, he's the first missionary. Samuel Smith is an enormously important person and has unfortunately, a very similar end that his brothers did. And we'll get to that in our next part, actually. But he was an incredible figure, and Joseph's younger brother. So Samuel leaves. He goes home. He is, as they say, filled with the Holy Ghost. So some excitement there. He's been baptized. He's had some wonderful experiences. Hyrum now comes down. And so Hyrum doesn't have a lot of the doubts, maybe, or he doesn't have a hard time with the story. I think because maybe Samuel prepped him for it. I mean, Samuel didn't know it. In my opinion, Samuel had no idea what he was getting into when he started asking questions when he got down to see Oliver and Joseph. So, from let me see. This is from one of the volumes, history volumes, manuscript history volumes. It says, though Joseph Smith recalled that Samuel Smith then returned to Palmyra, he likely remained in Harmony until at least the 6th of April, when he signed and witnessed a land agreement between Joseph Smith and Isaac Hale. During this time, he worked as a farm laborer and briefly served as Joseph Smith's scribe. So the history might tell us that Samuel just kind of booked it and then Hyrum came down. But there is a bit of a discrepancy there. It could have been a little bit more, nuanced than that. But anyway, just that's a footnote from, again, one of the history books, the Histories, Volume 1. All right, so I kind of like this too. So draft 1 talks about all this. He talks about Samuel coming, Hyrum showing up. Things are going pretty good there, even though, again, the Smiths don't just believe stuff, which I find interesting. And then we get the exact same introduction as draft 2. And then what I love is that it puts it, I mean, look at this. It puts it in a little cloud and it says, which is very nice. It says, hey, just so you know, I'm not going to write this down. It's on page 167 of the Book of Commandments. Well, basically the Book of Commandments, sorry. And that page 167, they are referring to, because again, this is years later, they're referring to the 1835 edition of the Doctrine and Covenants. So he's basically like, I'm not going to write this down. It's already been published. So if you look at the 1835 edition, you're going to see we're on page 167. But you don't get it in a cloud like this. It's nice, pretty handwriting. So there you go, a little bonus there. It is in Hyrum's case, it's a much shorter story, which to me implies a much more of a faithful response. Like, I'm already kind of believing this, so this is okay with me that John the Baptist ordained you to a priesthood and you baptized each other, sort of thing. But we don't get much. What we get is, not many days afterwards, my brother Hyrum Smith came to us to inquire concerning these things, when at his earnest request, I inquired of the Lord through the Urim and Thummim and received for him the following. So Samuel gets to be the first baptized guy. Hyrum does not. Actually, Hyrum is baptized much later. So there's a couple of other interesting things that evidence not just the narration here, but that kind of prove that this happened after what we would call Section 13. We're in Section 11, right? So why Section 11 sort of technically should be coming after the Aaronic priesthood restoration. There's a scrap of paper on draft 3. So this is Howard Corey, different person. This is not James Mulholland anymore. And what's interesting is it's pinned to the page, and we have it highlighted here. And it says, appealing to the Bible for the truth of the doctrines we advanced. So that's one way of knowing, like, hey, I know we're talking about baptism and immersion, and there's always been sort of a debate about how to baptize and all that stuff. So there's a little scrap of paper pinned in here. We also get from the historical introduction to Documents, Volume 1, about this revelation. Although the exact date Joseph Smith dictated this revelation is unknown, the heading given in the Book of Commandments placed it in May of 1829. The time frame can be further narrowed because the revelation originated sometimes between May 15, which is when Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery baptized each other, and the end of May, when David Whitmer arrived in Harmony to help move Joseph Smith and Cowdery to Fayette, New York. Further, Joseph Smith's history states that Hyrum arrived not many days after Samuel's departure, and that Samuel was baptized at least a few days after 15 of May. Given this sequence of events, the revelation was likely dictated in late May, but before Joseph Smith, Cowdery, and Whitmer departed for New York around the 29th of May. Hyram's arrival late in the month and Joseph Smith and Cowdery's prompt move thereafter probably account for this not being baptized until after, his not being baptized until after the relocation to Fayette. So Hyrum Smith was not baptized at this time. He was baptized in upstate New York. So kind of an interesting thing. Meaning it seems like Samuel and Oliver and Joseph maybe had a little bit more time. Obviously Samuel had time to go into the woods, pray for himself, take his time, come back, get baptized, make it back home, blah, blah, blah. So there you go. So again, in the aftermath of this section, which is a lot about, it seems like Hyram's like really anxious. Like, I want to get going. I want to do something about this. And Hyrum is not the first missionary. That goes to Samuel. The Lord kind of tells him like, hey, shush now, like chill. Let's take care of some things first, but now's not the time. However, if you prepare, and this is the missionary scripture, this is from a lot of things having to do with teaching. It says, if you prepare, if you study it out in your mind, and if you prepare and you have my words, you'll have my spirit and my word. And those two powers combined is what they call the power of God unto the convincing of men. And so this is a major scripture in the importance of preparation. Why do we tell our members to pray and read their scriptures and fast on fast Sundays and all this kind of stuff? It's because if you have the Spirit of God and the Word of God, you combine those together, that is the power of God to convince other people. So again, obviously would be used very heavily in full-time missionary service. So a lot of that comes from this. And Hyrum is again, we're going to get to that in the next part 3. But a very highly, highly regarded man in his time and later. I mean, his influence on the modern Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints cannot be understated, and it is enormous in a lot of different ways. So from this, Hyrum Smith is not baptized in Pennsylvania. He is baptized in upstate New York a little later on because they move out. He is also, along with Samuel Smith, one of the 8 witnesses to the Book of Mormon, again, published from 1830 until today. That is in those books. He becomes a member of the First Presidency eventually, specifically the second counselor in the First Presidency. And once Joseph Smith Sr. passes away, Joseph Smith Sr. was considered the patriarch and a revelator to the saints and all those kind of things. He becomes the second patriarch to the church after the death of his father. So Hyrum Smith, at the time of his death, was actually the patriarch of the church. And on his tombstones, on his memorials, you will see patriarch is the title that is most often given to describe what he was at the time of his death. So that is section 11. Again, very directly used and spoken to Hyrum Smith. When we get into section 3 here, this sort of bonus section is, again, this is going to be a little bit more anecdotal, trying to keep it to what we have in the Joseph Smith papers. Going to talk about the kind of influence he had, the kind of influence Samuel had, a brief life sketch about who these people are, very similar to what we did with Joseph Sr. and Alvin, if you missed those. And so, yeah, that's section 11. Moving on to just talking about some good brothers. Enjoy. Okay, welcome to part 3. This is entitled Hyrum Smith, but we are also going to be talking about Samuel Smith a little bit more. And you may have to forgive me. I have very wonderful feelings about my brothers. I have sons myself. And so this one was kind of a tender one for me, reading this. Because there was just some things where when you're reading it, it's like, okay, yeah, life is hard. It's the 1800s, everything's hard. But when you think about the order of events and kind of what happened to these people, there's some emotional stories in here. And just some wonderful things. Again, this is maybe a little bit more anecdotal, but with, Samuel and Hyrum, in my opinion, both sort of having a lot to do with this stage of church history and having the first section. Joseph Smith Sr. has section 4. Now Hyrum Smith gets section 11. Samuel Smith has a major part of a lot of this. I felt it was best to kind of dive into this a little bit. So a life sketch of Hyrum Smith. He was born in 1800, so he's almost 5 years older than Joseph Smith. He's born in Tunbridge, Vermont. And if you know, for a long time, the Smiths lived in Vermont. They farmed there. He actually went away to school from the ages of 12 to 15 years of age to the Dartmouth College. So he was formally educated and boarded there. I mean, he went off to school and did his thing. So I did not know that. I thought that was interesting. He was a farmer and a cooper. And cooper is a great name. But if you don't know what a cooper is, it is an actual barrel maker. So if you're feeling cooped up, perhaps you're in an emotional barrel. Just something to think about and talk to your therapist about. But anyway, so yeah, he was a cooper, a barrel maker. He was a member of the Western Presbyterian Church in Palmyra. That was his church affiliation in 1820 when the first vision occurred. If you recall that the Smith family kind of went in different directions in terms of which church they did. Joseph was partial to the Methodists, and apparently Hyrum actually joined the Western Presbyterian Church. He marries a woman by the name of Joshua Barden. That's on the 2nd of November, 1826 at Manchester. So he was 26 years old when he was married. Now, to me, in 1826, that seems like a kind of an older age to get married. I don't know if that was true at the time. But that is something interesting about the Smiths, is they didn't get married when they were like 17, 16 years old, like some other people did. So interesting. I'm going to assume that had a lot to do with just their financial circumstances. This was not a wealthy family. They had to constantly work just to keep themselves fed. So that's my personal opinion. Joshua actually dies on the 13th of October, 1837. So they are married for 11 years by the time she passes away. And she's pretty young. He marries, about 2 months later, marries Mary Fielding. And just so you know, he did have children with Joshua. They had a couple of children there, and those children did have a pretty, again, some significant dealings with the church. But he marries Mary Fielding on the 24th of December, 1837, so about 2 months later. And Mary Fielding, that name Fielding is very well known in modern church culture, if you don't know, and we'll get into that in a second. But that name Fielding it appears a lot. And Mary Fielding is she's an incredible woman. Joshua was an incredible woman. Like, these women really went through a lot and did a lot more than they were asked to do, to say the very least. Anyway. So Hyrum holds several Nauvoo positions in especially civic and church duties. He was a member of the Nauvoo Masonic Lodge, which was a really big deal from the late 1700s. Like, most of the founding fathers were Masons, all the way up to, I would say, kind of the mid-20th century. The Masonic Lodges were a really big deal. He was the vice mayor of Nauvoo. Didn't know that. He was also on the temple committee for the Nauvoo Temple. He does die in Carthage jail in 1844. He was 44 years old when he was shot. When we'll get into the details of that in a moment. Callings in the church. He was ordained a priest and presided over a branch in Colesville shortly after the organization of the church in 1830. He was ordained a high priest and served a mission to Missouri. So he, like Joseph, Oliver, Brigham Young, Samuel Smith, served missions. Joseph Smith Sr., who gets the famous Section 4, does not. So, such is life. He was a counselor to Bishop Newell K. Whitney, who was what we would now call the presiding bishop of the church at the time. Far smaller church than it is today, of course. He was part of the Camp of Israel, which is a major campaign at the time. He was a member of the Kirtland High Council. He was an assistant president of the High Priesthood. He was the second counselor to the first presidency, and he was in something called the Council of 50. This was a sort of theocracy, so to speak. There were actually non-members of the church that were part of the Council of 50, and this is one of the main reasons why Latter-day Saints now live in Utah, if you want to know. The state of Utah you can thank to the Council of 50. This is an organization trying to help these people out, and eventually was used as the main organizing effort to get the Saints out of the United States into, uncharted territory just outside of Oregon, the country in Utah. So you can kind of thank that council. He was a member of that as well. As a patriarch, that's what he's known for the most, right? So he was the second patriarch to the church after his father dies. So here's what we get from the Joseph Smith Papers website. If you look up in the reference section under people, I pulled this from there. It says, appointed patriarch of the church, released his counselor in the first presidency, and appointed a prophet, seer, and revelator in the first presidency, instructed to, quote, act in concert with Joseph Smith, who would, quote, show unto him the keys whereby he may ask and receive and be crowned with the same blessing and glory and honor and priesthood and gifts of the priesthood that once were put upon Oliver Cowdery. So Oliver Cowdery leaves the church, and Hyrum, in as clear terms as I can ever find, this is from a section of the Doctrine and Covenants that I've just quoted, takes Oliver's place in all things. Oliver never denies his testimony to the Book of Mormon, and neither does Hyrum Smith, but he does leave the church. A myriad of issues, actually, that I would say are pretty legitimate. So that is Hyrum Smith. We get some scriptural information from the Doctrine and Covenants about Hyrum. So there are actually 7 sections of the Doctrine and Covenants that either involve or are directed to Hyrum Smith. Sections 11, 23, 52, 94, 111, 115, 124. Either like section 11 is obviously directed just to Hyrum Smith. And the rest of them, he's named. He's there when the revelation is given, which means it could have been part of his question as well, whatever was referred to there. Section 135 actually is the announcement of Hyrum Smith's death. I'll get into who wrote that in a little bit. So the announcement of Joseph and Hyrum dying and what we call the martyrdom of those 2 men at Carthage jail is canonized as section 135. Section 138. So this is years later, and this is kind of if you think about what the circumstances of this moment are, it's pretty significant. So this is in the throes of World War I. Section 138 is given in, I believe, 1918. If my memory serves, I could probably just easily look that up. But it's World War I, and Joseph F. Smith is now the president of the church. Joseph F. Smith, and that F does stand for Fielding, is way advanced in years. We are now in the 20th century, and this is Hyrum Smith's son, who is very, very, very young when Hyrum was sort of forcibly taken from his family and later shot. Yes, this was October of 1918 is when this was given. So you have the son of the man living in another century, living in Salt Lake City in the throes of World War I. And so the world has changed a lot. And there's the Spanish flu, and tens of millions of people have died in this conflict. And so Section 138 actually describes, so this, if you don't know, Section 138 is a vision that was given to Joseph F. Smith about what life is like after death, about what we call the spirit world. And he's talking about how, like, then this is why we have temples. Like, we do proxy work for people who have died. They accept the gospel. Apparently, there is a missionary effort going on in the spirit world where people are actually preaching the gospel, just, I guess, like they do here. We don't exactly know how that looks. And that is how this work happens. And then the ordinances that you needed, like baptism or confirmation or whatever the case may be, is done in temples on earth. And in this section, he actually describes his father. He actually sees Hyrum Smith and his uncle Joseph Smith in this vision. And this is towards the end of his life. And he's lost a son. Actually, Joseph F. Smith lost a lot of his children to death. It was just death. There was just death everywhere. If you know anything about the late 1910s, I mean, the teens, if you will, there was so much death in the world, and a lot of it was disease, a lot of it was war. It was a bad time. And so for him to be able to see his own father, again, if you're a believer, is a pretty remarkable thing, a pretty fascinating thing, I would say. So that's another section in which Hyrum is described. So again, a very, very important person to a lot of different people. He's described as being very anxious to serve in section 11, almost like, please wait, like pump the brakes, bro, like that we're not quite ready yet. That's section 11. That's what that means. Pump the brakes, bro, is not exactly what they said, but just take my word for it. It's the theme. Don't worry about it. He's also, this is a very famous scripture about him. Section 124, verse 15, he's described as having integrity. And reading here, it says, "And again, verily I say unto you, blessed is my servant Hyrum Smith, for I, the Lord, love him because of the integrity of his heart, and because he loveth that which is right before me, saith the Lord." Um, so yeah, a nice shining, recommendation from on high if you believe in that sort of thing. I just think that's a very lovely language as well. So then we get into his death, and this is one of the reasons why a lot of people know a lot about Hyrum Smith, is because of this episode. So he was actually, at the time, if you don't know, he was actually running for the Illinois state legislature as an independent candidate and as a member of the Nauvoo, and he was a member of the Nauvoo City Council when he was killed. So this is a man who holds some political office. So some people actually term it assassination, because that's usually how you term it when somebody who's holding office or is a candidate. And by the way, Joseph Smith at the time, a lot of people don't know this, was actually running for the president of the United States. His candidacy was official. He was an official candidate running for the presidency of the United States, the president. And so he was actually the first American candidate to be assassinated. He was the first presidential candidate to be killed. So he gets that place in history, unfortunately. So we get to Carthage jail. Now, why were they there? Well, they were awaiting a trial. The underlying reason for it is that they destroyed a printing press that was printing something called the Nauvoo Expositor, which was an anti-Mormon tract. It was meant to incite, and they were almost even dared to burn it down. They say, you can count your days. If you touch this press, you can count your days from that moment. And so there's a lot of fighting words going on there. And I've talked about this in a previous episode about, First Amendment rights and how the fight is real, even to this day, about what those rights mean. However, the official charge that they had was treason, because Joseph, as the head of the Nauvoo Legion, there was a military unit inside of Nauvoo that was part of their city charter. And Joseph Smith, as the sort of lieutenant general of that legion, enacted martial law in Nauvoo because of some bad events that were going on, let's just say. And so they were charged with treason, and Joseph and Hyrum were thrown in the Carthage jail. In the room with them was Willard Richards, who was a very large man and was a major figure in a lot of things. We'll get to that in a moment. But he was a very large man to say, and that's significant for the story later. John Taylor, who at the time was an apostle, and I'll just tell the story. So Willard Richards, John Taylor, Joseph Smith, Hyrum Smith are in the room. Are in it. I wouldn't call it a jail cell, because it was the upper room of more or less a jailhouse. There was an open window. It wasn't like supermax security or anything like that. During that night, it was raining quite a lot, and so somebody's wearing a heavy overcoat and can smuggle guns. He, for some reason, misses the pat down, and so Joseph Smith and Hyrum Smith, at the time of a mob storming that place, were armed with pistols with 6 bullets each. So Hyrum actually never gets a shot off. They're saying about a crowd of about 150 to 200 men who apparently had used gunpowder mixed with water and smeared that on their face to distort their features, stormed the jail. They were all pretty heavily guarded, or pretty heavily armed, a lot of rifles and whatnot. The guards weren't much use at that point. They all rush up to the second floor, and here's where the story gets going. So Joseph and Hyrum both had guns. Hyrum never got a shot off. Somebody shoots through the door, and the bullet strikes him in the left side of his nose, in the face. He is shot in the face, falls to the floor. There's another instance where he is maybe shot through his body and hits his pocket watch, but he dies almost instantly because he gets shot in the face. He exclaims, "I am a dead man," and he's more or less dead by the time he hits the floor. Joseph actually fires 6 shots. 3 of those shots misfire. 3 of those shots don't work. The other 3 actually do strike a couple of people in that mob. So you may not know this. The door is opening. The men inside are pushing it back. Hyrum gets shot in the face. He's dead. Joseph and the others are still pushing on the door. Joseph pulls his gun out and tries to fire 6 shots into the open doorway. One of them shoots William Voorhees in the shoulder. One of them hits John Willis in the arm, and William Gallagher is actually shot in the face and survives. There is apparently a fourth person they're not really sure about. All three men, since they were injured, that served as a proof that they were there and that they were guilty of murder. And so they were ordered to trial, but all three of them fled the state and were never brought to justice, never brought to trial at all. So assuming that they were actually there and all those kinds of things, they were never brought to trial. So those three injured men, we don't really hear from them much after that. Again, Hyrum was shot multiple times after sort of the melee was over. So even after he was on the floor, they shot him a few times because they saw a target. So he's in the jail room and he's passed away. I know that Joseph F. Smith went back to the jail once and there was still some blood on the floor, and he asked them to remove him. Yeah, he didn't want to see that. So pretty tender moment for a son, seeing the place where his father died. And this is a place you can still go to. The Liberty Jail, or the Carthage Jail, is still standing. And there are tours of that place that people can go to. So, yeah. Sorry, no son should have to see that. Forgive me. Joseph, on the other hand, gets some shots off, more or less drops the gun, heads to the window. He is shot 3 times in the window, then falls through the window. And there is a report that claims that when he hit the ground outside of a well, more or less, he was still alive. So the mob propped him up, set up a makeshift firing squad, and shot him many more times and made sure he was dead before they fled the scene. And the entire mob ran off. They thought they heard a bunch of Mormons coming. They said the Mormons are coming, and they all ran off. Now, in the middle of all this, you have 2 other people that are still in the room. John Taylor, who actually gets shot about 4 times, as I recall. He gets shot, falls to the ground, and rolls under the bed just to try to escape. Willard Richards is standing, as the door kind of swings open, he's standing at the hinge point of the door. So the door is kind of blocking his view, and he's using a walking stick that he has just to smack away any barrels that come through the door. He just smacks them out of the way. Any muzzles that come through the door, he smacks them out. He gets slightly grazed on his ear. This is the largest man in the room, and he hardly has a hole in the coat of his garments. He is in a volley, and he survives. He takes John Taylor, because he doesn't know what's going to happen next. He takes John Taylor over into an area that was a bunch of hay there. And since he has a lot of weight, he actually lays on top of John Smith. He was a trained physician and felt that that would be some way of stopping the bleeding, since John had been shot multiple times. And he laid on top of him and saved his life. All of this account, written by Willard Richards, is what we now call Section 135 of the Doctrine and Covenants. So Willard saw it all. He saw Hyrum get shot in the face. Joseph left. He saw John roll under. He was kind of standing in a corner watching all of this, trying to save lives by just smacking away guns being pointed into the room. And what he wrote is now canonized as Section 135. He saves John Taylor's life, and John Taylor eventually actually becomes the president of the church. So it goes from Joseph Smith to Brigham Young. So once Joseph is killed, there's a kind of a tense moment in Nauvoo area where they don't really know who the leader is. It was actually recently depicted in a film called 6 Days in August. And you might see me in that one. I'm not necessarily a good guy in that one, so forgive me for that. I'm a nice guy, I promise. But anyway, Brigham Young eventually takes over. Sort of the quorum of the 12 eventually takes over. They move the saints to Salt Lake. Brigham Young becomes the president of the church, builds up all the territories of Utah. He dies in, I believe, 1877, and then John Taylor is made the trustee of the church for a small period of time, and then is basically just ordained to the president of the church. So, thank you, Willard Richards. Saved the life of a prophet. So John Taylor becomes the 3rd president. So Hyrum, after all this is over with, Hyrum is actually buried next to Joseph and Emma in Nauvoo. They were originally buried in the ground, but because of flooding of the river close by, they were eventually exhumed, photographed, and then placed in the tomb where they're currently at. It's gorgeous, actually. It's a wonderful place. If you're ever in Nauvoo, you can see it to this day. But that's what it is. So his family after this ordeal, actually moves with the Saints from Nauvoo to Winter Quarters, Nebraska, and then they move on to the Salt Lake Valley. And his sons, his posterity is enormous, and they've had a massive influence on the church. I'll get to that in a moment. But before we get to that, a story that I didn't fully appreciate until I read about, I just find it interesting. Before Section 11 shows up, Samuel Smith comes, has kind of a hard time with his story about the John the Baptist and getting baptized. He eventually is the first convert to the church, is baptized, serves the first mission of the church, is the means of getting the Book of Mormon into the hands of Brigham Young. And what's really interesting about this, I didn't know this, Samuel Smith actually was riding to the aid of his brothers by the time they got shot. I don't know exactly what happened, but he had to evade some attackers on his way to Carthage jail, which for some reason caused some major physical strain on him. He had a quote, stitch in his side, and caught fevers and all sorts of stuff. But apparently there was some sort of a major strain for him trying to ride his horse and make it to Carthage jail in time. And that fatigue of that and some of the effects of whatever may have happened to him during that really affected his health in a major way. He was the one that found his brothers dead. He was the first one on the scene. And so when these men who shot and did the firing squad and all this fled the scene because they thought the Mormons were coming, it was actually just Samuel on his horse. So this younger brother finds Joseph dead, finds his brother Hyrum, and he sort of takes care of the bodies. So 3 brothers at once. According to his mother, well, and I don't have to say according to anybody, just about 30 days later, Samuel dies. Now, he's given a generic sort of 1840s diagnosis of what was wrong with him. His mother believes that it was the strain of losing his family and also whatever happened to him that night evading attackers. But yeah, Samuel dies a month later. So Lucy Mack Smith's history about, the history of Joseph Smith by his mother, she's rather angry at the end of that book. Joseph Smith Sr. had died already a few years previous. And then in the matter of basically 1 month, she loses 3 of her sons to what she would call mobocracy. She blames the governor of the state. She's very angry about this, but she loses a lot during this time. And again, just as a father of sons, like taking all the rest of it out and who these people were and what they did in the church and all that stuff, like that's a pretty brutal story. What was interesting before Samuel dies is that some people believe that he should be the next president of the church because he was sort of the next brother in line. This was very short-lived. Not many people really hearkened to that too much. There was a really wacky instance where his other brother, William, actually claimed that Hosea Stout poisoned him in an effort to eliminate Smith or any successors in the Smith family so that Brigham Young could take over. This was kind of dropped right away. Samuel was a little bit unhinged on occasion. In fact, him and Joseph got into a pretty brutal fight once that was very public because William was an apostle at the time that this happened. And so anyway, that's a thing. It's in the history. It's a verified story, but again, nothing really came of it much. But yeah, that's Samuel and Hyrum. So what is the legacy of this man? Just speaking specifically of Hyrum, I could go off for a very long time about the rest, but just specifically about Hyrum, who was there with Joseph when he died and gets his own section of the Doctrine and Covenants. His descendants are where this really comes into play. So I've already mentioned his son, Joseph F. Smith, becomes an apostle. He actually serves a mission at the age of 15 to what's called the Sandwich Islands. We now call it Hawaii. In my opinion, one of the main reasons why the church has such a major influence in Hawaiian culture, in Tongan, Samoan culture, not like the biggest thing in the world, but there's a significant presence there. And that's one of the reasons why there's a lot of people from those islands that are actually in places like Utah, California, Nevada, all sorts of places. Anyway, so Joseph F. Smith, he serves a mission at 15, becomes an apostle. He is an apostle during the presidency of Brigham Young and becomes the president of the church. His grandson, Hyrum Smith's grandson, Joseph Fielding Smith, becomes an apostle and also a president of the church. So Hyrum Smith is a patriarch. Joseph F. Smith, his son Joseph Fielding Smith, those two men, Joseph F. and Joseph Fielding, are both presidents of the church. His oldest son, Hyrum's oldest son, John Smith, Uncle John, we did a whole thing about this one, becomes the next patriarch of the church. So the third patriarch of the church is John Smith. He becomes patriarch in 1855. And those descendants from him held the office until it was no longer a thing. So the general church patriarch was John Smith, and it was passed down. I did an entire section about this a couple of episodes ago, all the way to Eldred Smith. I want to say it was 1978 or maybe earlier. The office of church patriarch was done away with. He was made an emeritus general authority, and he actually died very recently at the age of 104 in 2014. So, yeah. Russell Ballard, who was, as of this recording, the most recent, before Jeffrey R. Holland is currently that person, but before that, M. Russell Ballard was the acting president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles and is Hyrum Smith's direct descendant. M. Russell Ballard recently passed away. In the year 2000, the Ensign, which is a church magazine that no longer exists, it's now called the Liahona, but they actually did a piece on this, and they estimated that there were around 31,000 living descendants of Hyrum Smith on the earth. And in my research, I also found out that in 1918, which is section 134 or 138, Joseph F. Smith era, his descendants actually erected a monument in Salt Lake City to Hyrum Smith's honor, and it stands to this day. And here's a picture of it. So a lot of stuff about Hyrum Smith. I've now gone through, I've already talked a lot about Emma, Lucy Mack, Joseph Sr., Alvin, who dies before the Book of Mormon is published, Hyrum Smith, Samuel Smith. This is an incredible family. And so, yeah, there you go. I hope that was interesting. Again, a little bit more maybe emotional than otherwise. And just as a personal note, my first professional acting gig in a film, my first major motion picture that I ever did was actually a movie called The Work and the Glory, where I actually played Hyrum Smith. And so if you want to know, like, my mother, who is an absolute graceful, wonderful person who I love, gives me this book, one of the only biographies about Hyrum Smith. And that's kind of what got me really, really into church history in this way. And so thank you, Mom. And also thank you, Hyrum Smith, for being a really wonderful example. And apparently I look something like the guy. So if you want, go look it up. It's The Work and the Glory. I play Hyrum Smith. It's a very small part. It was a wonderful experience to play a really interesting man. So with that, thank you again. And I hope you're enjoying this. It's definitely enjoyable to put them together. It's a lot of work, but it's great. And we'll see you next week.